All right, my name is Raul, and I also work at Shopify. I'm also an engineering manager for the iOS team, but I am the point of sale branch of the company. And what we're talking about today is property wrappers, and which is a new feature in Swift 5.1, I think. One of those five numbers. And then these are the things we're going to be discussing, like what are they, how are they useful, and a few examples of them. What are they is pretty straightforward. I'm pretty sure you guessed it right now. It's actually something that wraps around a property, and then that's pretty much it. But the longer explanation is that actually the compiler is creating a shadow type around your property. So it's actually transforming what you think is a string or an int or whatever into a wrap value. And then we'll see it, why that matters later on, but it's mostly important if your types need to be codable, because of this magic new property, they probably won't encode and decode themselves. You'll have to do the actual help by giving them the coding keys and all that magic stuff than before. So this is a typical problem that we have at Shopify in one of our screens. For example, we want to make a screen that creates a note, but we also want to save the original node in case someone changes the value of it. There is a way for us to revert back into the previous value. Or if you click cancel, for example, you want to say, oh, you haven't saved changes. Do you actually want to close this thing? And then this is something trivial, but this can be improved with a property wrapper. Well, how do we create the property wrappers? This is just basically two things. We need to use the property wrapper attribute at the top, and then we need to implement wrap value t, which is obviously whatever you want. And then to actually solve the previous problem, we can see the file, which is a horrible name, but this is the name of the property wrapper. All right, here we are. So the property wrapper for dirty, which is actually something that's keeping track of the value that we pass to it. Our initial requirement is using the property wrapper attribute, and this is just a struct that has the conformance of everything inside of it needs to be equatable and codable. That because we don't know what we're actually going to pass in. It could be a struct, it could be a class, it could be anything. So we are actually enforcing codable, so we can do a nasty trick at the bottom, which is we take that value that you pass us, we serialize it, and then we deserialize it again. And that way, if it's a class, we don't maintain the reference to it. We're just creating a brand new one. And if a struct, we're also just passing the struct, and that's it. And that value then is being checked if it's actually an optional, because I don't know if this is an actual problem or a feature, but whenever you're using a property wrapper on a nil or an optional value, the initializer is immediately called with nil, and then it's called again with the actual value that you supply. So in this case, we're actually checking that it's an optional, and then we will wait for the second time we call this, and then we actually invalidate the whole thing, where we actually go and say that the original value is the old value, and then we just toggle the thing, so we never hit this did set again. And now with all this code, which is probably a lot for what we're going to do, now we can transform our thing into this. And then we can actually go back to the talk. So now the example looks like this. We replace the original node with something just tagged as dirty. And then that way, when we want to check if it has changes, we just go the underscore node, does hasn't saved changes. The hasn't changed changes is a function inside the property wrapper itself, like the dirty type. And know that we have to use that special syntax there, because this is what the compiler is actually doing. The compiler is taking a dirty node, and then it's transforming it into a node with a string and a underscore node with a dirty class wrapping or initial value. And this is why we have to, if we want to call things that are only in the property wrapper itself, we have to go with the other property. And then we just want to talk to a string, then we just use the normal one. But how are they useful? useful. I find them very useful because you still maintain the type. Whenever you're going to work with Node, you're not working with Node dirty, like optional value generics. You're only working with string. And now all your consumers, we just like use string directly to it without any like random. Also, this gets more complex as we start adding more things because a property wrapper cannot have another property wrapper in it. So if you want to have two of them, you have to create one that wraps the other one, and that's where like that starts getting horribly messy. So sadly, that's why we're not using any of this on Swift UI, because Swift UI is everything is already a property wrapper at state, at publish, at everything. And how can we do more with a property wrapper? There's something more exciting that we also use at Shopify as well, user input. Like anything a user is typing on a screen is actually very, very useful for this. And then we stole some of this from like Java and Rails. Let's take a similar normal user model that has a name and an email. How do we know that this is valid? We can add as many like business logic here as we want. The name is required. The email is an email validator that has to be like 4 characters long. But then we can do this easier with, well, I have to do this again, but we'll see what happens now. Oh, we survive. So now what we do is we go into form input. And this is something more complex now because we already have a validator class in Shopify that we use to validate every single value that we use. And then we wrap everything in a form input. And this form input will validate any value that you pass to it. It will tell you if it has any errors. It will tell you if it's valid or not. And then it will also tell you the actual error that it has, if it has any of them. And then we can see them in action actually here. For example, the dirty one, we can see this. We create the person name is Raul. It has some changes false, but if you actually mutate it, it says true. If we set it back to Raul, it just says false. But then the most interesting one, which is the form input. Now we have form input for name, which has a validator of required validator, and email has a validator of email. And then we can actually check if the whole model is valid by just calling each of the property is valid property from the property wrapper itself. And then we can actually check if there are errors from just using it directly. If you remember, the first name was required. So if I change it, I'm doing light coding now, which is a bad idea, but it's working. So now the actual debugger error will say your field name is required, so it's incorrect. And then you will check here that it says is valid false. And then the other one was that it needed a valid email. So change the email to something that is not required, though it just failed and says invalid email as well. And obviously this works like a normal property. If I never wanna have Raul in, if I never wanna have error here, I just set it to Raul, and then that will set Raul to the wrap value of the property input, and they will validate it, and then everything will be fine. Go again. No, I suck at this. Okay, and then this is great because now is way more like explicit. When I look at the user and I see name, it says like require. When I see email, it says email validator. If I had like telephone number, I could put a count validator that has like between 6 and 12 like digits if I want to. Like it could be literally whatever. And if you want actually more example of this, there is a NS Hipster article about property wrappers, and it goes in depth about a bunch of like tiny ones, like trimming values, clamping value, which is something that we should actually implement. And the one that everyone writes lately is user defaults. You like tag something has user defaults, so that property can be like stored in the user default and then retrieve whenever you read or write to it. It's actually kind of nice. And the summary for the talk: what are property wrappers, what are they useful, and a few examples. Hopefully all of that got through in the small problems that we had, and then that was it. Thanks. Any questions though? You, person I've never seen before.
Thank you. Could you use property wrappers to implement an undo redo stack as well?
undoing stack.
Undo, redo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
actually, I that's the third one that I want to make.
Oh yeah, nice.
Yeah, because we have the undo, and then we want to attach the undo to the actually iOS undo manager thing. The only problem is that that also is using that little hack that copying like deserializing. So we have to be very careful where we use it, because if we use it per property basis, it's going to be like a gigantic hog, a CPU hog. But if we do it in the state, it will be actually nice because the state is only mutated like a handful of times.
Is there no cleaner way of doing that serialize deserialize stance?
No, that I know of, but I would love some suggestions how to do that, because obviously I have no idea what is being sent to me. So this is the less insane option that I have found so far.
Anyone else?
Is there any way to like combine property wrappers? Like if I wanted to have something form input and dirty?
Sadly, no. You have to make a third property wrapper, like dirty form input that actually combines both of them,
Okay.
which sucks. Yeah, I actually wanted to do this all in Swift UI, but I couldn't because I couldn't update any in the screen because the screen needed to be at state.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Throw it.
Easy there. Is there a way to pass a value into a property wrapper so that you could do something like dependency injection?
Yeah, definitely. And that is what the form input one is doing. So whatever the only thing they actually require is wrap value, and then anything else can just be created. You just need to initialize as well. So the wrap value is then the default that you actually use, and then whatever else you define comes after, and then you see it here. Like whatever you define are your actual arguments, and then the default value is what I type here.
Right. So that's what I'm wondering if you can do. So on line 42,
Yeah.
you have required validator passed in there. Can that come in through this user structs init somehow?
No. That's always here at the top. Yeah, in the init, it could, but then the init will have to be that shadow type. You have to be like format input. Like this will have to be this, I guess, in order to work. No, this thing. And obviously this is not gonna like because this other, okay, great. You get it. But yeah, that actually will be good because we have a bunch of services in the app, and then it will be great if we can inject the services into the property wrappers instead of just like being dangled in there at the top.
Thanks.
No problem.
Anyone else?
All right. Thanks, everyone.